Okay, we'll start the second half of our program here today, which is our panel of experts, which will also include the initial speakers. So as Milton said, my name is Hans Klein. I'm on the faculty of the School of Public Policy here at Georgia Tech. I worked intensively on ICANN matters at the birth of ICANN. That's where I first met Milton Mueller around 1997, 1998, when the whole issue of the privatization of the internet and the institutionalization of the IANA functions of domain names and IP addresses became an issue in the late 90s. ICANN was created in 1998. The privatization announced in 1998 was deferred a little bit, and then was deferred a little bit, and then there was a little web page was put up by the U.S. Department of Commerce, and somewhere buried in the text it said, well, maybe this won't be happening real soon. We don't really intend to be doing it just yet. And, well, it's now been 18 years, so it's quite a remarkable event that we're witnessing today, is this the transition to private internet governance, initially declared in 1998 and finally achieved in the year 2016. So it's a historic event. It's very significant. It's significant for the internet, and it's significant globally because this is a very unusual institution. It's a global institution with certain governance functions. It's performing internet governance, and everyone says, well, how are you going to do global governance? You're going to have a global government? Are you going to have different countries working together in these complex processes? Will the United States just run things? And here, I think we're seeing a novel institutional innovation with ICANN, which is global governance, global rulemaking, and coordination taking place without official governmental oversight. It's a social process. These are social actors, stakeholders, the multi-stakeholder process making these governance decisions. I think it's an interesting experiment. I intend to watch it closely. This is where it really gets interesting. If it's been interesting so far, I think this is where it really gets interesting from 2016 forward. So, as Milton Mueller said, we have a panel of distinguished experts in the field. I'm going to quickly introduce them, and then I'll pose a few questions, and then we'll get some discussion going, and later we'll open it to questions more generally. So let me run through our four new faces up here. As Milton said, Peter Swire. Here, Peter, if you just raise your hand when I say you, thank you. Okay, he's here on the faculty at Georgia Tech and the Scheller College of Business, as well as with a courtesy appointment in the School of Public Policy. He's also senior counsel at Alston & Bird law firm, and he's one of 5 members of President Obama's review group following the Snowden revelations, and formulated a very significant report that was a response to those events. Earlier under the Clinton administration, he was the chief counselor for privacy. That's Peter Swire. Peter, I'm going to ask you a question, and then I'll go through and ask others. I'll do these introductions as I go through. So, you're our Snowden revelations expert. That very significant and controversial event brought a lot of attention to the U.S. role in cyberspace, the U.S. role in the internet, the perception that the U.S. had disproportionate control, disproportionate powers of surveillance, and so on the internet. It affected a lot of things in the U.S. One of them, arguably, was perhaps this decision to grant greater autonomy to the IANA function, to privatize the internet itself. So, would you say a little bit about the cause and effect, if there is any, between the Snowden revelations and the privatization of the internet?
Great, thanks, Hans. And first, let me thank Milton and Hans for having been in this area for so many years and made such a big difference to the governance process. And thank my friend Larry Strickling. We worked together in various stages, including in 2009 and 10 on broadband funding in the U.S. government. And Larry has done the 8-year thing. He's been, which is, he was on the campaign for Obama, he worked in the transition, and he went into NTIA, and has been a public servant for the last 8 years. And in some ways has been working towards this for the whole 8 years. And I think the history will show reasons for gratitude to Larry for getting us to October 1st in this way. So thank you, Larry.
Peter, I'm told your microphone isn't on.
It's it is? Okay. Yeah, it's echoing in my own head, but that's always a problem for professors, you know. So on Snowden, a very quick point on Snowden, and then I'd like to make one quick point on multi-stakeholder that Larry talked about. So the Snowden did start in June of 2013. The review group report happened in late 2013. During that time, we met with Larry, met with other people in a lot of federal agencies. And the review group report specifically supported the process that was then underway that Larry described. And we supported it as part of the broader view of how the internet should be open and interoperable and secure that the US government has had as a sort of clearly stated approach. And we supported multi-stakeholder processes. So I'm all in for what Larry has been saying. And I think that in order to have legitimacy for how the internet is run, picture yourself living in whatever foreign country you want to think of. China, Indonesia, a small country in Africa, whatever. Why the heck should the United States be doing this, especially after Snowden when there's all this surveillance, so it looks like it might be an NSA front? That's not the way Americans tend to think about things necessarily, but it's a theme that you can, I think, understand if you were living in these other countries. And so coming to a new, legitimate, accountable answer that's not a US-run answer is a way to have an internet that people can trust going forward. And that's to the benefit of the United States, at the center of the global trade system, at the center of the internet in a lot of ways. Just one brief thing on multi-stakeholder processes. One thing that wasn't mentioned in my background is I was chair of a global multi-stakeholder process called the Do Not Track process of the World Wide Web Consortium. And it failed miserably. It wrecked my life for a year. It didn't happen. It was just really not good. After that, I wrote one factor that I thought mattered to when these stakeholder processes work or don't work. And it has to do with interoperability and win-win. When you're trying to connect a network together so everybody gets a wonderful network, there's a lot of win-win, there's a lot of interoperability, and everyone has a stake in getting to something good at the end of the day. And those are times when when multi-stakeholder tends to work relatively well. If it's a zero-sum game, the advertisers want more data and the privacy people want less data, and there's no clear gains to interoperability, it's much, much harder to get anything like consensus. And so we tried and Do Not Track to come up with different levers that would push people towards it being a win-win, but couldn't do it. So I don't know, and maybe Larry can come back to this later, but that sort of win-win interoperability versus win-lose and we're not going to agree is at least one of the dividing lines in my own mind and experience for when multi-stakeholder tends to work better. Do you want a sentence on that before we go to other questions, or wait to wrap up? Okay, so I'll stop there and I'll stay.
Okay, great. Thank you, Peter. So we're going to keep working through our panel, and then we'll have the more free-flowing discussion, will be the next phase of this. So my next expert on the panel, Konstantinos Komaitis, Senior Policy Advisor at the Internet Society with responsibility for global public policy development. He's also played many roles, like everyone here, many roles in the ICANN community, including chairing the non-commercial users constituency and being a member of the special trademark issues team. He has 2 law degrees and a PhD and has authored a book on domain name regulation. So my question here concerns, we've got a new way of achieving a new institution for global governance. And there's it's an experiment, there's different possibilities about the future. One question is the role of the staff in ICANN. What we'd say in academic circles, the bureaucracy, formerly meant the bureaucracy of this entity called ICANN. Many people have perceived that the ICANN staff, which is officially subordinate to the board of directors for taking its direction, but there has sometimes been a perception or a criticism that the ICANN staff, as can happen in an administrative unit, the ICANN staff has a certain degree of autonomy of action and sometimes even pushes in certain policy directions rather than taking the lead from the oversight board. So I'd like you to comment a little bit on that. What do you see the role of the ICANN staff in the past? How do you see it changing with the events that we've had this year with the privatization?
Thanks, Hans, and hello, everyone. First of all, thank you for having me here. I'm going to take a step back. First of all, I would like to, I don't know how familiar you all are with the Internet Society. So just briefly, the Internet Society is a global organization with more than 80,000 members and 116 approximately chapters worldwide. And we are the organizational home for the Internet Engineering Task Force, which of course sets the standards for the Internet. In the NTIA announcement, the Internet Society, along with the IETF and other organizations was identified as a directly affected party to the transition. So we actually followed the transition very closely and we participated. And we're coming from an angle where the question, I think this keeps on breaking, the question we always ask is, what is good for the internet? And of course the accountability discussions, it was, and I think we've heard it from both Larry and Milton, it was very soon very clear that accountability is a very important aspect for this transition to go forward. So in the internet, the sense of community is very important. There are a lot of communities, and those communities are self-governed. So actually the concept of accountability is important. And it has always been important, but it wasn't really until the announcement where we actually saw how much of a role accountability plays in respect to IANA, but also more generally in this context of internet governance. And there are a couple of things that we also learned. First of all, that communities always have had their own accountability mechanisms, and it is important that they maintain the autonomy to actually have those accountability mechanisms without imposing them on them. And also the fact that accountability discussions never stop, and they should never stop. And this was also very clear in this ICANN process. Going back, circling back in order to finish my short intervention, I think that what is currently has happened in the ICANN community, we have heard a lot of criticism that staff is not really accountable, that they have been doing things that the community perhaps did not want. However, this is a post-IANA transition era. There are strong accountability mechanisms. Those mechanisms ensure that every single member of the community, including the IANA staff, are part of these discussions. And they're part of these discussions, and this is a very important thing, from the beginning. So it's not until late that they engage, but actually everyone has the ability to engage in the beginning. So I am very hopeful that everything that the community has put in place will actually provide the incentives for a more robust accountability structure where the things that we have seen or perhaps have seen will not be happening. Thanks.
Okay, great, thank you. Our next expert, Keith Drazek. He's the Director of Policy at Verisign Corporation, Verisign Inc., which is the operator of the .com and .net domain name registries. He's also, of course, like others, been very active in the ICANN community for many years, including the role of chair of the GNSO Registry Stakeholders Group, and he also represented North America on the CCNSO Council. Now, for those of you who haven't been living ICANN for the last 10 years of your life, might be asking, well, GNSO, CCNSO, et cetera, I'm not going to unpack all the abbreviations. I'll let folks do that on their own. But Keith is with Verisign Corporation. I wanted to ask you a question that's on some people's minds. Verisign's a huge corporation. It plays a very important role in the domain name system and in internet governance generally. And some people have expressed concern, not necessarily with Verisign, but with corporations generally. You've created a governance institution, and it may be novel in many respects, but we have a whole 100 years and more of governance, thousands of years of governance institutions. One of the issues that comes up in governance and institutions is the question of capture. That sometimes some of the parties who are a part of the community that is governed, who are subordinated to the rules that are made by a governance institution, that they can get disproportionate influence. And this isn't Verisign in particular, could be any number of ways that some of the members of the internet community could effectively gain disproportionate influence and shape the kind of rules that come out of a governance institution. So I'd like you to comment a little bit. We've now got a privatized internet governance. Are we safe against capture? Or is there a concern of that? Tell us about that perspective.
Okay, thanks very much, Hans. And thanks, Milton, for the invitation to be here. And this is a great opportunity. Glad to be here with you all. So my name is Keith. I work for Verisign. Verisign is the registry operator for all of the .com and .net domain names, and also provides the root zone maintainer services or function now after the transition under an agreement with ICANN called the Root Zone Maintainer Agreement. So, Hans, in response to your question, I've been asked why Verisign would be interested in helping to empower the community, the ICANN community. And when we talk about the accountability reforms that have been introduced as part of this transition process, there is a new concept called the empowered community. And the empowered community is basically representative of all of the different interest groups within ICANN. It includes governments, it includes contracted parties, it includes civil society and academia, the technical community. And this concept of the empowered community, the group now has collectively the ability to hold the ICANN board and the ICANN staff to account. And so I've been asked, why would Verisign, a contracted party with ICANN, be interested in somehow further empowering other parts of the community? And the answer, in my view, is pretty simple, is that we trust the community coming together in a multi-stakeholder process, a multi-stakeholder model, working together in a bottom-up, consensus-based approach. We trust that empowered community far more than we would trust an untethered regulator, a group that could potentially be not accountable to the broader community of stakeholders. So throughout this process, Verisign has been committed to the transition, but based on two requirements: the continued stability, security, and resiliency of the DNS, and an ICANN organization and board and staff that is accountable to its stakeholders. And we do believe now that those tools and those protections are in place. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. And our last expert here, Andrew Sullivan, who's the chair of the Internet Architecture Board. And my students in my Internet class will be familiar with the Internet Architecture Board and how these institutions evolved over time. So he's chair of the IAB, and he's also the director of DNS engineering at Dyn, a little-known company that one never reads about in the newspaper, that's engaged in internet performance management, basically ensuring that traffic gets delivered faster, safer, and more reliably than ever, and that occasionally, or at least in once, has been targeted with a distributed denial of service attack in a very interesting way. Question to you, Andrew, concerns the relationship between policy making and standard setting and technical decision making. There have been times, there's been an ongoing debate between the standards community, the IETF, the IAB, and others, in their relationship with ICANN, which, although it often describes itself as a purely or almost purely technical organization, nonetheless has significant policy making functions. And so sometimes there's been tensions between the technical community, IETF, and ICANN. Will that change at all? With the change in ICANN's status vis-a-vis the US government, do you see the technical community being more insulated or less insulated from the policy-making community? Can you comment a little bit about the relationship between technology and policy?
Sure, thanks. So I'm Andrew, and thank you for inviting me today. I'm pleased to be here. I am a geek, right? I make bits flow on wires. So I'm one of the people who normally looks at the policy making stuff and says, well, that's really boring, and you know, I want to know why we should be interested. One of the things, and it's been entertaining the past couple of years as I've been IAB chair, because what this meant, of course, is that I do no useful work for my company, right? What's actually happened is I've turned into this weird internet politician that I don't understand. and the consequence of that is that it's allowed me to understand something that maybe I didn't understand before about the internet. You know, I always knew that the internet was a network of networks, it's a voluntary system and so on, but I did not appreciate the extent to which that is true. And I think that this is the key thing that many people who are the critics of this transition missed, but to his credit, Larry seemed to understand really right down to the soles of his feet, and that is, you don't get to be in charge of the internet. One of my colleagues on the IETF once said at an open microphone, on the internet, you are so not in charge for every value of you. So the key thing here is that, I didn't make that up, that was Phil Allenbaker. The key thing here is that this is a voluntary system, And the standards that the IETF, quote, sets are just the ones that everybody is willing to use, right? The IETF has published lots and lots of garbage. We have published things that nobody has implemented. We have tried, for instance, to replace the WHOIS 4 times, and none of them have worked. So those are examples of things that didn't work. And the reason we didn't was exactly, I think, this point that was made before, that we didn't line up the incentives correctly. I published a piece a little while ago that says, you know, on the internet, it's made only of carrots, there are no sticks. You know with the donkey, right? You've got the carrot and the stick. Well, you don't have any sticks on the internet because you don't have any control. So what you have to do is set up all the incentives the right way. The policy discussion often proceeds from the point of view that you know, somebody's in charge and they get to impose this kind of control. And I think what has happened when you found the technical community looking at proposals that are coming out as policy proposals and saying, you know, kind of pointing and laughing, to be honest with you, we say it won't work. And the reason we say it won't work is because the incentives are aligned incorrectly. The nice thing about the new accountability mechanisms and the process that ICANN has gone through over the past couple of years, and I guess has continued to go through, is that people are learning, I think, very quickly that you know, the importance of the consensus is not, you know, so that everybody feels good. The point of the consensus is so that you don't have any objections anymore that cause you to believe that the whole thing's going to fall apart. That's why it's a rough consensus in the IETF, for instance, right? We get to this point where we say, hey, well, like, this is good enough, can everybody live with it? There are no strong technical objections, now we think we can proceed. And the reason we think we can proceed is because it's going to work. This is an engineering effort. It's not, you know, it's not cuddly time where everybody feels good. The goal is to make something work. And I think that to the extent the policy mechanisms around the DNS stem from that same basic functional question of, is this thing going to work? Then you know, people are going to be satisfied with it. And when they're trying to create policies that are or satisfy, you know, political considerations or whatever, that's not going to cause a functional policy that will go. So I think that there'll continue to be back and forth there, but I don't think that the tension you know, that maybe sometimes happens is going to change one way or the other.
Okay. Milton, did you want to make a
Yeah,
point?
I wanted to enter in on this because I think it's important to understand when we transitioned the IANA functions, and Keith was on the ICG with me, there were 3 different parts of it. So the protocols, which is what Andrew is dealing with, but the IETF is about the number assignment within protocol standards developed by the IETF. The numbers is the IP address allocations, and the names is the domain name system root. Now, in my mind, one of the biggest weaknesses of this technology policy relationship, and one of the biggest weaknesses of the solution we eventually came up to, has to do with the names IANA functions. So the protocol people got a hardcore contracting right. IANA is their, ICANN is their employee. And if they want to fire them, they just say, sorry, see you later, somebody else will do this for us. Same with the numbers people. And with the numbers people, ICANN kicked and screamed a bit and didn't really want to do that, but ultimately they kind of had to because Larry was watching them, right? So those 2 communities got a hardcore contractual right to just fire ICANN and say, see ya, we're done with you, you're not doing what we want. Now the names community had never been properly separated from ICANN, so the policy part and the IANA functions part were all mixed up in a big multi-stakeholder stew, if you will. And I think we sort of created the ability, and we sort of separated it out by creating a separate affiliate, corporate affiliate of ICANN, but the process of breaking that away from ICANN is so elaborate, so complicated that it's hard to perceive of it ever really taking place without something going so badly wrong that you know, it would be hard to figure out what to do next. And we're still having a bit of an implementation problem, if I'm not mistaken, Konstantinos, with whether the ICANN legal has actually fully created this separate corporation and whether it's just a division of ICANN. So this is something we really need to pay attention to.
Okay. So thank you very much. That's our sort of formal presentation talk by each one, and we're going to get into a little more interactive phase. We're going to go on for about another 20 minutes or so. It may stretch longer if we want. We're going to go run until about 5:30, and open to question and answer both in the audience and among you, between yourselves. Since I'm moderating, I get to take the first question, even though I've been asking all these questions. I want to have one more for Larry Strickling. My question is this: is this process really over? Policy process, somehow they never really end. Was October 1 safely the end point? Are there still a few more things that could happen that could prevent the new phase from beginning? Because really, I'm interested in what's happening, what's beginning now. But before I ask that question, are we really ending what used to be the case? Is it over?
Can you define it for me?
Yeah, even that's a little. Position is ICANN private. Is the Senate going to come back, and can they still reverse this?
No. All right. So keep in mind, as has been explained, that the actual transition planning had two tracks. One, and I think Milton explained this very well in his remarks, there was the track to actually transition the functions that were covered under the contract that ICANN had with us. And those were these three functions: the protocol parameters that the IETF generates, the distribution of IP numbers that is the issue held by the regional internet registries like ARIN here in the US, and then the third one was the issue of the naming, the domain name system and the authoritative root zone file. So that work was all performed by ICANN under a contract with us that designated them to perform those functions. So that contract has expired. It can't be brought back at this point in time. The other piece of that, as I mentioned, was that we had also had a separate contract with Verisign under which they manage the root zone file itself. That's the directory of the top level domains, .com, .net, and so on. And if anybody wanted to change that file, they had to go through Verisign, but Verisign couldn't make any changes to that file without getting authorization from us. So we've modified our agreement with Verisign that they no longer have to get authorization from us. So as of today, all changes to the authoritative root zone file now go directly from ICANN to Verisign, and the United States government plays no longer any role. It was merely a clerical role to begin with, but that role is over. It isn't going to come back. The other track was this accountability track that we've spent time talking about, and that's where Keith got into these new powers that the community now has to force the board of ICANN and the staff of ICANN to be more responsive to the community. That's going to be an ongoing process. ICANN has been engaging in accountability reviews for years. Milton mentioned that under the affirmation of commitments, there was created a process called the Accountability and Transparency Review Team that's held every 3 years. There have been 2 of those that have been conducted so far, one in 2010, one in 2013, and Milton mentioned I was on the first team. I was on the second team too. I mean, we were down in the weeds on these issues. And there will be a third team that will get started next year. But accountability improvements is an ongoing effort. It's never going to end. There will always be something new to look at. One of the things that's on the table is having looked at the accountability of ICANN itself, what about the accountability of these supporting organizations that are supposed to reflect the views of stakeholders? So you have the supporting organization for the generic names. You have the supporting organization for the country codes like .us. You have advisory committees like the Governmental Advisory Committee. What are the protections to make sure they're accountable to the stakeholders that participate in them? So that's never going to end. That's always going to be subject to constant review and improvement and evolution, and nobody should want that to end. So in that sense, that'll be an ongoing process. So does that respond to your question?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Could I come back and comment on Peter's point?
Yeah, I invite actually for now you comment across the lines. Yes.
So I thought Peter made a very trenchant comment when he talked about win-wins are good for multi-stakeholder, zero sums are not. Nobody can dispute that. But I think part of it comes to Andrew's point, which is you have to find a way to define the issue as a win-win. So what's an obvious example of that? If you were to bring together industry and environmental groups and consumer groups to solve climate change, you could approach that as a zero-sum problem, which is we need to reduce emissions by this set of industries, and we need to improve investment in this set of industries, and you would get the usual stalemates that often result from that. But if you could actually convince people that we're about to lose our Earth, and we really need to come together and find a solution for it, now it takes on the element of a win-win. And people have to put their parochial interests to the side and actually come down and figure out how are we going to solve this problem. I'm not telling you it's an easy thing to do, but that's part of, as we look at how to use this tool of multi-stakeholder discussions and decision-making, we have to find a way to identify problems and define them as a win-win, or as in, I loved Andrew's comment, the all carrots. I'm going to remember that one. I'm going to steal that one from you, Andrew. And that's the challenge I think all of us have as we want to see these processes used. Otherwise, we fall back into the stalemate and the failure, the dysfunction of all the Washington processes, if you're talking about an U.S. issue, where you can't get anything through the regulatory process, you can't get anything through the legislative process because there are too many people who will be satisfied with the status quo. You've got to break that somehow, and that, I think, requires a lot of public support, a lot of public engagement in order to define these issues in a way that bring people to the table to actually find solutions.
And if I may just add to what Larry was saying, it also requires collaboration, right? True collaboration between the communities, and this is exactly what we saw in the context of IANA. There was a purpose, there was a goal, there was a deadline, and people came together, and people came together and actually worked in order to be able and come up with a plan that satisfied the NTIA criteria and was good for the internet.
So, and just to add on to what has been said here, but also to reflect some of what Larry said in his remarks, is that, you know, after 2.5 years of intensive work by this entire community in this ICANN space, the results, I think, will absolutely deliver accountability structures and tools that the community has needed. There's no doubt in my mind that this will be a success, but there is more work to be done. At the outset, you can imagine there was a laundry list of concerns that were developed, and those concerns were divided into 2 different work streams. Work stream 1, those that were required to be resolved largely before the transition could take place, and then everything else. So there is ongoing work on 9 or 10 different issues: human rights, jurisdiction, the accountability of the supporting organizations and ICANN's own internal structures, staff accountability, transparency and disclosure obligations. So there is ongoing work. But I think it's really important to note that ICANN's community, its stakeholders, multi-stakeholder across all of the different groups, came together over 2.5 years and proved that it can work together and to deliver meaningful results. That's not necessarily something that had been proven before, but these last 2.5 years of intense and at times very contentious work have delivered meaningful results. And those results have been legitimized by the process and by the participants. As Larry noted earlier, this was not something that was dictated in a top-down fashion. It was actually something that brought the community together, gave the community the opportunity and the tools and the resources and the support to be able to do the work. And I think it's certainly a very positive development.
Just real briefly, so there's a lot of people in the room who are students, and you're trying to imagine how does this apply to me? One thing is, I think, incredibly important to this process is listening to the other people and understanding what do you really need here? Why are you so upset? And so that listening to whoever you're negotiating with is key. The second thing I'd emphasize in negotiation is sometimes called BATNA, the best alternative to a negotiated agreement. If those people don't agree with us and they walk away, what's their life like? And if the life is they don't get the internet anymore, then they have to come back to the table. If the life is they can walk away and they don't care and it might even be better, then they don't have to really compromise. And so understanding the BATNAs for all the different stakeholders, what their alternative to an agreement is, is really essential, because then you know why they need to be in the room and what it's going to take to do that. So you have to listen, and you have to realize they could walk away. So how do you make it so they stay in the room? And I think those are things you can bring to your own life when you're facing group decisions.
Okay, I'm going to open it up to more of the discussion up front, but also participation from the audience as well. If anyone has a question, you're invited to raise your hand and speak up here. And otherwise, at the same time, people are thinking in their own heads among yourselves as well. If you have comments or questions between yourselves, I invite to turn into sort of more participative format right now at this point.
Student question.
Phil Weiser has a trick where he insists the first question's from a student. So is there any student who's brave enough to do that here?
Yeah, their question is, who's Phil Weiser?
Oh, fine. He's somebody listening. He's a good guy.
Yes.
Hi. What do you believe is unique about the case of the internet as a kind of standard-setting issue that possibly contributes to this new institutional arrangement being formed? Is there something new about the internet itself, and maybe delve into that kind of interconnectivity that is happening in this discussion, versus something like agreements on global banking arrangements or other standards?
Let Andrew start.
It's Andrew here. This is, maybe you don't know this, but at the IETF, you have to say your name into the microphone every time you do, because there's a transcript, right?
And Andrew, if you can repeat the question, because she doesn't have a microphone.
Yes. So the question was, what was unusual about the internet that creates this kind of governance thing, as opposed to, say, international banking, where it's treaty-driven, or another close example is the telephone system, which is also internationally driven by treaty, right? A key piece of this is actually hidden right there in the name internet, right? The internet is a network of networks recursively all the way down. So my network exchanges packets with you, and that's internetworking, and then you exchange with other people, and gradually we build these things together. And so on your network, you make your rules. On my network, I make my rules. And what we have is a system whereby we can exchange packets with one another without any prior agreement. So the whole protocol is designed so that we don't have any other agreement, and we just exchange packets with one another. And the reason we do this is because it's convenient. Not because there's a treaty or anything like that, but because it's convenient for me to get packets to you, and then I can get my books from Amazon. Well, I don't get books from Amazon anymore, because who uses paper, right? But once upon a time. And the reason, therefore, that we didn't have a treaty organization to do this was because the technology was designed not to need it. It was designed specifically to avoid that kind of central system. The phone system and the banking system, both internationally, actually evolved the other way, right? They were monopoly systems that were closed, and then the way you got an agreement to exchange with another system was you set up an agreement with them, and then you had to have a prior agreement. At the beginning of you still do this with wire transfers, particularly in the United States. I grew up in Canada, and I was astonished when I moved here and learned that the banking system here doesn't work at all. Because there's this very complicated exchange that you have to do. You have to set up, basically you have to know the whole route in order to get the money there. That's a really weird thing to do. But it's because you've got all these agreements all the way along. In the phone system, in the original phone system, for instance, if you wanted to call somebody on, the Bell system, you needed to have a Bell phone on your desk. And if you wanted to call somebody on the ITT system, you had an ITT phone on your desk. And so you will see these old movies where people have like 10 phones on their desk. That's because there were 10 phone companies. And that's the way that system worked. And gradually we chipped away at that by having these routing systems that were all based on having prior agreements with people. So there is a technical fact that undergirds all of this. But the cool thing about it, of course, is that once you've invented that technical fact, you can't forget about it. And so what this does is it gives us a path forward where we see, hey, wait a minute, the internet system is way more efficient than that other thing. It doesn't require all of these agreements in advance. You just get this efficiency, which is why all of your telephone calls go over the internet now, because it's way cheaper to use packet switching and so on and not have all of these agreements in advance. And that is the that's the lesson that we get from this thing, that once we've invented this style of thinking, we can apply that style to other kinds of things. And so I think there's an opportunity actually for future governance, people who are working on this, or future technical policy people, or for that matter, future engineers who are just working on the technology to use this kind of mechanism and tackle systems that way.
And I would just add that you referred to this as a new governance process. Multi-stakeholder governance or multi-stakeholder processes, I mean, it's going back to, it's a form of direct democracy. I mean, it's older than, our U.S. Congress and any regulatory agency. The question is, how do you invoke that tool, and how do you find issues that will attract people who want to participate in a direct way? And that's where you get into these legitimacy questions I discussed in my remarks. But somebody, I don't know, maybe it was Milton, said it's kind of like the old Quaker meetings, years ago, decades ago, when people would sit together, and it's very much built on a sense of the commons, which was a characteristic of things in New England years and centuries ago. But it still comes down to having an issue where you can get people to engage. We like it because we think you get better ideas. And if you don't think that, go back and watch any hearing that's been held on Capitol Hill regarding the IANA transition in the last 2 years. You can look at the one that I had with Senator Cruz on September 14th, and Andrew was up there. When were you up there, Andrew? It was
May.
Back in May. Our legislators do not understand the internet and how it works. And so you should be very worried if they're out legislating in this space, because they don't really understand it. Whereas if you can get a community of people who have an interest in it and are really coming together to solve problems, you can, I think, make great progress. We use the tool at NTIA, and we're not a regulatory agency, so we can convene people to come in and try to solve problems. And so in the last 2 years, we've brought together a group to deal with the inherent suspicion that exists between companies, software companies, on the one hand, and people who are out trying to find vulnerabilities in their software on the other hand. Tremendous amount of distrust there. But I think we've made some interesting progress in trying to bridge that gap and getting software companies to understand that maybe these people could actually perform a valuable service in terms of finding vulnerabilities, but it's partly creating that structure which allows those folks to basically relate to each other and talk to each other. And so we've run a totally voluntary multi-stakeholder process to try to help bridge those gaps. And I think it's worked pretty well. We've done the same thing with some privacy issues. So we're trying to find the opportunities to get people used to doing this. It requires a skill set that you do not find among Washington lawyers and people who do Washington regulation, because they're too used to the zero-sum game. They're too used to, how do I protect my status quo? To succeed in a multi-stakeholder model, you really have to come in and have the ability to help people reach consensus. That's not a skill you find in great quantity in Washington, D.C. among people who get paid to do these kinds of things for a living. But gradually, I think we're trying to create a culture and a sense that there is this kind of technique has promise, and people need to build that skill set in order to be able to be effective in that type of scenario.
I need to get in here. So there's a element of your question, and I think Andrew correctly emphasized that the design of the technology played a role here. But I still think it would be possible for example, the internet to have developed in the United States, for us to have decided that every country gets their own country code and all domains have to be under that, that every interconnection with the internet in other countries could have been negotiated through a gatekeeper, as some countries are doing now. So what really was, in addition to the technical design, what was different was that this community of interconnection and interoperability and standard making developed behind the backs of those in power, and they created a fax on the ground, in effect, of global interconnectivity before the powers that be could notice. And I think that was one of the critical things that really created not only the necessity, but the fact of alternative governance arrangements.
Okay, yes, question.
I'm a layman, I'm not a student, but I follow this. So my question is, do you consider government is a part of the multi-stakeholder? government,
Right.
like global government. So if you consider that as part of the multi-stakeholder, and then how could you avoid, those people, behind and then try to influence the internet governance policy?
Right. So the question was, what's the role of governments in the multi-stakeholder process? And this became a huge bone of contention as we tried to explain the transition to our policymakers, because there was this theme that emerged from some of the opponents that somehow governments, this transition was going to give governments more power once the U.S. stepped back from the contract. That just was not true. The bottom line is governments participate in these processes, as do other stakeholders. In the ICANN model, governments, as I mentioned earlier, participate through a governmental advisory committee, which is empowered under the bylaws to provide advice to the ICANN board. They themselves don't make any decisions, and indeed nobody from a government can sit on the ICANN board, but they can make advice. There was, in the ICANN model, if there's consensus government advice, meaning no government objects to a piece of advice, the board is presumptively expected to follow that advice. But if they don't want to, they can reject it, but they have to reject it on a vote of 60% of the board members. So that's how governments provide their input. But the way the model is constructed, and with these improvements and clarifications that were made in the bylaws that took effect on October 1st, there's no way governments can take control of this process and dictate to ICANN what to do.
Yeah, but it's important to have governments involved, because if the government gets really, really mad at the process, they can put everybody in jail. Right? Government, in the end, has the power to coerce people. And if there's nationals of that government, at some point, if the government gets annoyed enough, they can do things like that. And so having the governments at least enough on board that they're not jailing people is a really good thing.
Yeah, we'll tell that to the But I think the question was also talking about essentially indirect subversion by governments. For example, maybe some states don't have completely separated civil society, so maybe somebody from, let's say, the Internet Society of China is really kind of not that independent, and you get them populating the at-large, or you get them populating a GNSO, and then maybe different governments get involved in this way. I think that's unlikely. I think the balance of power in the new empowered community is designed to prevent that, but it's not something that's impossible, and certainly not something we should refuse to think about.
Okay.
And this is Keith. So to go back to build on what Milton just said, and to go back to Hans's question about capture, it's a legitimate question in any organization. And I think, again, the balance and the checks that have been put in place through this process greatly minimize the potential for capture by any group. And I think that the fact that this empowered community must come together and agree based on certain thresholds and percentages to be able to exercise any of the new community powers is a really important check and balance in the whole process.
So this is Andrew again. There is a point here, though, that I think you're exactly right. That we have these checks and balances, but they'll only work if people participate, right? So the other piece of this actually is that if you actually think there's a problem here, of danger of people taking over and so on, then you too can participate, because the only thing you have to do is join a mailing list. So it's not that hard. And the good news about it is that it allows people to participate in these things, because if people don't do it, this is just like voting or anything else, right? If people don't do it, then it ends up being taken over by the people who are interested, and the people who are interested might not have your interests at heart.
Okay, we're going to keep taking questions. I did want to say, I know that 5:30 p.m. at Georgia Tech campus can be an important time for people, so I know some of my students, if some folks trickle out quietly, that's okay, and we have this room for another half hour, so it's great to have a panel like this. It's almost a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. So we're going to keep the discussion going. If you need to trickle out, feel free to do so. Question, yes?
At one point, you described the process as more of a direct democracy. And also, wanted to make the point that there's like an inherently political aspect to this, that my concept of a perfect internet is different than maybe an individual from China's concept of a perfect internet. So what's the kind of check and balance to factions taking strength or, getting too strong within the system? Like, how do you break down those?
This is Larry. I think part of it is the requirement for consensus. In other words, you don't move forward until the room is at a point where everyone is pretty much in agreement. So I think that has an important role in marginalizing people at either extreme because they'll never pull the room with them. And I think that's important in terms of helping to find consensus. And I think it also helps blunt the idea that a faction can take over because unless the faction is everybody in the room, you still might not have consensus.
But there have been, in the past, the pre-transition ICANN has been sort of willing to ignore certain voices and say, well, we have consensus except for you, but you don't matter. We went through kind of a rebalancing of the GNSO, which effectively made it more balanced around 2006 or 2007. But it's not inconceivable that people who are persistent, who have the funds to regularly send people to all of these face-to-face meetings and maintain people full-time on the lists, and who actually, it's a knowledge question too. Ordinary people who wander into these meetings probably take about a year to really get up to speed on what in God's name is going on these mailing lists and learn all the acronyms and learn what the real issues are and not get manipulated by people. So it's just like direct democracy. You can have your vote bought. You can have people, bullying you. But again, the structure is trying to be balanced such that you need these different stakeholder groupings to be in at least 3/4, 75% one way before you can get anything done. So one of my concerns with the future is that it's so balanced and you need such a strong consensus that you may not be able to slap ICANN on the wrist when you need to, because the community will be divided on whether it is done is wrong or not. And some people might have a vested interest in them doing something wrong, and they might be able to block the consensus needed to slap it on the wrist, to throw off a board member, or reverse one of their decisions. It's going to be very hard to get that kind of consensus, but again, this is a heck of a lot better than what we had before.
Carl. Hi, Carl. PhD student at the School of Public Policy. As a nonprofit corporation, is ICANN at risk of mission creep and to advance potentially other issues of ICT capacity building? And would this be promising or a risk? And if promising, what other projects do you think ICANN is well positioned to address?
Stakeholders?
So this is Keith again. I would say...
And repeat the question, at least in summary.
Yeah,
mission.
So one of the questions, or one of the parts of the question was about, as a nonprofit organization, is ICANN susceptible or inclined to mission creep? And I'll tackle that one first, and if others want to jump in on other questions. So I think the answer is ICANN is less likely to engage in mission creep intentionally or inadvertently today than they were a month ago. Some of the reforms that have been put in place and some of the language in ICANN's bylaws is much more explicit as it relates to ICANN's appropriate mission. So I think there certainly were concerns, and I would say there are probably still concerns about mission creep. It's going to be something that we as a community need to keep an eye on, be watchful over. But I think the risks of mission creep now are much less than they used to be. I don't know if anybody else wants to tackle the questions of broader ICT implications.
It's Andrew. This question about broader ICT implications is an important one, because in my view, and I think a view that has been expressed by the IAB several times, ICANN has a very narrow mandate, and it should have a very narrow mandate. It should not go venturing off into, being the government of the global internet. The global internet doesn't need a government, and it especially doesn't need one that was invented in order to do a pretty narrow clerical job. So from our point of view, I don't think I'm speaking in a turn. I have to be very careful when speaking for the IAB because I can be removed at any minute. They voting right now. That's right. They're voting right now.
No, it has to be consensus.
The thing is that we have, particularly in the engineering part of the internet, we have a bias in favor of just enough stuff. Right? So we get things that are just working well enough that the thing is running, and then you don't need to do anymore. And the reason for that is because it's never certain that if you get it better, you'll get the right thing. The development of the internet itself actually looks like that, right? While the internet was being built and they were building this crappy IPv4 thing, the OSI model was being built, and it was this perfect, beautiful system that was all nicely designed, and there were all kinds of architects and so on. We have IPv4 today, and officially we have the OSI model, but in fact nobody uses the underlying technologies. When was the last time you got mail over X400? The reason you don't get that is because that system was too good, right? They wanted to make it perfect, and there's a very famous paper in computer science called The Rise of Worse is Better that is about the development of Unix and how it beat Lisp. And the reason for this is because it got 80% of the way there, and the rest of it was garbage, but it didn't matter because it got your job done, and you could ship it. You could ship it now. The fact that you can make the thing work is the thing that tells you it's good enough, and now you can stop. And so the idea that what we should do is create a global thing that goes out and does global ICT stuff. Well, we have the ITU, and they're doing that just fine. And I'll let you decide whether those things are effective.
I'll say a word on mission creep as well. The mission of an organization and the evolving and developing mission of an organization is somewhat of a function of who the participants in that organization or institution are. So one thing that's happened with ICANN is that national governments no longer have as direct a role as they had in the past, or had oversight of ICANN become a collective, maybe in the UN model, with many governments performing oversight, that would have given a lot of governments greater input into the process. Well, governments bring with them a certain perspective, and by many respects it could be considered a good perspective. For instance, say redistribution and economic justice, equalization of resources. So you see in the history of the ITU, which does have governmental oversight, it has a communications mission, but over time it took on a developmental mission and a certain degree of wealth transfer as well. Why did that happen? Because entities concerned with development, equity, redistribution played a major role in the ITU. Governments were there overseeing the ITU. Notice that by many perspectives, that mission creep is a positive thing. Wonderful, we promote development. Wonderful, we redistribute wealth. Others say, particularly the communications engineers who gave rise to the organization initially, they say, we're losing our focus on making agile, effective, innovative communication systems. We're turning into a redistribution entity, and we're getting overly politicized, et cetera, et cetera. So in the case of ICANN, with ICANN privatization, to an important extent, you're excluding certain voices, and for better or worse, the voices for maybe social justice, the voices for equity, the voices for redistribution aren't going to have that much of a role in ICANN, and the engineers and the technology and technical policy community keep control, and that's likely to keep the institution focused on its mission. I think there's less likely to be, in some ways, mission creep because the engine for mission creep has now been excluded from ICANN. For better or worse. I'm not sure you can say it's absolutely better.
I think the elephant in the room here is the enormous pot of money that was generated by auctions over new TLDs. So ICANN is sitting on, what is it, $26 million? Something like that. And we're now debating through a multi-stakeholder consensus process what to do with it. And so Hans may not be correct in the sense that there will be forces, or could be forces within ICANN who say, give me some of that. And ICANN may find it that it empowers itself as an organization to be a redistributor of this wealth, although there are, you're correct, strong forces within it who don't want it to do that. And there are people during the reform process, one of the big things that I took a great interest in was the redefinition of its mission in ways that were designed to keep it boxed in into a very narrow space of activity. But just let me give you an example. Let's suppose we put in what I call the First Amendment of ICANN, which is a little thing that says ICANN shall not regulate content. And we had interesting debates about the word regulation and content. But let's suppose that ICANN does something that constitutes a regulation of content. I can tell you, the GNSO would be against it, most of them. The non-commercial stakeholders group would be against it. But well, suppose the governments like it. And let's suppose the at-large advisory committee, which has sort of cooperated a lot with GAC, says, yeah, we kind of like this too. And anyway, we're forming an alliance with the GAC because we want to be more powerful within ICANN. So then you've got two of the we got 2 of the 5 members of the empowered community blocking a override of that decision. Now, we do have a check and balance against that, and that is the independent review process. So that's like the judicial system of ICANN, in which you can take an appeal outside of that more politicized empowered community process, and the sort of independent judges will decide whether they are outside of their mission or not. So we have 2 layers there of control. It's easy to conceive of how one of them would break down. It's possible to conceive that both of them would break down, but I think we've done a pretty good job of creating these barriers to mission creep and expansion on the whole.
Yes.
As of October 1st, now that ICANN is no longer operating in conjunction with the U.S. government, I believe that it's not under the antitrust exemption laws. So how are the front-end users or like aspiring small businesses be affected by this? How are we to be sure that ICANN's not going to be acting as a for-profit company or like a monopoly now that they're not under these laws?
Well, this is Larry. Your premise isn't right. No. You've been reading too much of the stuff that's been put out there to misrepresent the transition. ICANN, from its creation, has been subject to the U.S. antitrust laws. There is no antitrust exemption that ICANN has ever enjoyed, period. End of story. And with the end of the contract, they will remain subject to U.S. competition laws. So nothing has changed in that regard. This issue of antitrust popped up in the May-June time frame by somebody who didn't know what he was talking about. I think it was thrown up there. And there was a period of time where people were throwing any issue they could think of up against the wall to see if something might stick to derail the transition. But that entire argument was based on a false premise, which was that somehow the presence of the U.S. contract had granted ICANN some exemption from antitrust enforcement that they just have never had. And you can go back to the the documents at the time ICANN was created, where we said from the start that it was going to be important that ICANN be subject to American competition laws from the beginning.
This is to pick up on that. And I haven't lived ICANN the way these are. I only know half the initials that they've selected, and that's after years of study. But I think there's a symbolic side to the debates about ICANN that's worth just raising up and pointing to. So I mentioned that for the rest of the world, having the US run ICANN and the internet after Snowden and after other things, that was symbolically bad for the rest of the world. They didn't trust the US. And I think that some of the opposition, such as Senator Cruz has led, is part of a different symbol, which is the US is losing sovereignty to some globalized something or other. And so within the US, you want to keep the US at the central level of running it, because that's what sovereignty and having America be great means. But either way you go, there's an opposition. Wow.
Keep pointing your.
Keep pointing it, yeah. Either way you go, there's a sort of symbolic criticism, either because the U.S. is keeping too much or the U.S. isn't keeping enough. And people get very, very worked up about the future of who's going to run the world or who's going to run the country. And then when they're that worked up, they say a lot of things that you really have to fact check.
Yes, ma'am. Yeah.
Okay. So I kind of have two questions. The first one might be based on my perception of the issue, but why did the transition seem to recently become such a political issue, and how has this current uncertain political climate affected the transition?
So the question was, why did it become a political issue, and how does the current, what did you refer to it as, unsettled political climate?
Uncertain.
Uncertain political climate affected the transition? As I indicated in my remarks, we didn't know until basically 6 o'clock on Friday, September 30th, whether we were going to be allowed to let the contract expire or not. First, because there had been a movement among a small number of members of Congress to try to put a restriction on the continuing resolution to keep the government open. There was a desire on the part of some senators and congressmen to put a restriction in that continuing resolution to order us not to allow the contract to expire. And then there was the last-minute court case in Galveston, Texas. Don't ask me why Galveston, Texas, but that's where the 4 states chose to go to court to try to get a TRO to stop it. And at the end of the day, they weren't successful. The continuing resolution did not contain any restriction, and the court in Texas, who had been handpicked by the plaintiffs to hear their case, threw them out of court. So I would say that it certainly led to an interesting 3 months. I had to answer a lot of letters starting back in May and June, coming from the Hill, asking questions like what happens to the antitrust exemption and other silly things that people had been raising about this that just weren't true. But at the end of the day, we were able to get it done. I attribute a large part of that to the fact that you had an overwhelming level of support from the stakeholders who had participated in the process. And that was noted by the judge in Texas, which was, all right, I've got 4 states in here who didn't participate for 2 years in the planning for this transition. They're coming in at the very last minute to try to stop this. And I've got all these dozens, hundreds of other stakeholders who developed the plan, who support the plan, who spent 2 years developing it. And I think the judge had that in the back of his mind when he threw them out of court in their request for a restraining order.
Yeah, Milton here. So to put it in a broader political context, you have a divided government. You have a Republican Senate and House, and you have a president who's Democrat, and the executive branch is Democrat. And then, of course, there's a sort of an insurgent conservative right-wing movement within the Republican Party, which has made a business out of trying to kind of obstruct or all the evil things that they think that President Obama is trying to do. So this is a perfect symbolic issue for them to continue this kind of crusade by accusing Obama of giving away the internet. I don't know, I collected a few of the cartoons while I was making the slideshow, and you'd be just amazed at the fun, I guess you could say, people had with the symbolism. And it's just, I think it's very characteristic of the current political climate for this to have happened. And I think the main thing I want to say here is that I'm glad, now that we've won, I'm glad Cruz did it. Because otherwise, if it just slipped out, none of these issues would have been raised, and they would not have been resolved in the minds of people. So what we've really done is we've strengthened the commitment to self-governance on the internet. We've said, we've considered the alternative. We've had advocates yelling in our face about what we should not be doing, and now we've done this. So I think that actually settles it much more decisively than had it gone out with a whimper rather than a bang.
Let me just, look, Congress is supposed to ask hard questions when there's big changes to policy, and whether it's oversight or considering legislation. And when I heard the antitrust one, when I was preparing for this, I hadn't seen that one before. I didn't know the answer right away, and I do a lot of antitrust stuff. And then it turns out there's an answer. So you should have the probing, and when people are worried about something, they probe harder. And then you hope out of that process you get some truth. And I think it turns out there's answers to a lot of the criticisms that weren't immediately apparent. So having the questioning is absolutely essential. It happens in this multi-stakeholder part, and it happens with Congress. But then when there's answers to the questions, it's worth noticing. That's how I look at it.
But what's the obligation of the people asking the questions to maybe do 15 minutes of research before they ask it?
I agree with that too. At least 15 minutes.
Yes.
Hi, it's two questions. What percentage of your stakeholders are based in the United States? And the second question is, kind of in this era of kind of secret courts, with secret interpretations, of secret laws, and the ability to send people based in the United States national security letters that order you not even know what to talk about, how can the technical community really have faith that this is anything more than just accountability theater?
Good question.
So it's Andrew again. The emphasis that I was placing earlier on the voluntary nature of the internet is a critical piece here. Because the truth of the matter is, if people are mad enough about the way any of this stuff works, are unhappy about the way the IETF produces its standards, are unhappy about the way the regional internet registries give out IP addresses or AS numbers, or are unhappy about the way ICANN runs the root zone, they can ditch it. You can do something else. Nobody makes you be on the internet, and nobody makes you be on the one internet that we have. It's more convenient if everybody's using this. But the truth of the matter, when one of the senators was going on, for instance, about how you're going to prevent China from doing some of these things, my response to that was, well, they already are. Right? That they have a national policy which says that certain things are not allowed to resolve from inside China, and it just doesn't work. You go there, you try to use Twitter, and you can't get there. And that is part of the nature of the internet, that it's a voluntary system. And so if the IANA root zone, for instance, is badly enough managed because people are doing secret things and sending people national security letters, the answer will be people will stop using it and they'll use some other technology. This has happened over and over again on the internet. Ask MySpace how important the first mover advantage is.
And in terms of participation, I cannot give you a percentage, but what I can say is that this was a truly global, inclusive process. The ICG, where both Milton and Keith were there, they were translating all their documents in all the UN languages. ICANN was translating all the processes, all the documents were out, so everybody could participate. The only thing you had to do was to have an email address, and you were able to say whatever you wanted, you were able to participate in the process. So Larry said it before, and I cannot emphasize it enough, how global this thing was. Everybody could be part of this and was part of this to a large extent.
So, just to add to that, I think it's important to remember or to understand what we're talking about here when it comes to the IANA functions themselves. To boil it down, it's basically keeping 3 databases, 3 registries, one for names, domain names, top-level domain names, one for IP addresses, and the other for the protocol parameters. And so when we talk about the root zone file and changes to the root zone file, which is one of the functions of IANA and now ICANN, it's basically the addition, removal, or status update or content update of top-level domains. So .com, .verisign, .net, the CCTLDs like .uk and .de, .ca. .us. So that's really what we're talking about. So while I think some of the questions that you posed may be important and applicable, I'm not sure it's actually specific to what the IANA functions are and what ICANN does.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I'm wondering how robust or fragile is the internet to the day-to-day workings of ICANN and the IANA? You know, what's going on with the IANA root zone, and did the transition make the internet any more fragile or robust?
And repeat the question just for...
That's in the Andrew question.
I get stuck with all the fun ones. So the question is whether how fragile or robust this particular function is as a result of having this one entity there, and did this transition make a change to that fragility or robustness? So the first part of the answer is that it goes back to this thing that I said just a moment ago about a voluntary system. Part of the way that we make sure this is not a totally critical thing that somebody has their hands around it and it becomes a locus of power is we have the internet, which allows us to say, well, if you try to abuse your power, we're not going to listen to you anymore. It is really convenient to have one place to look up all the port numbers, right? To know that when you go to a website, you're on port 443 or port 80 or something like that, and that just happens. It's really convenient to know that. It's really convenient to have one top-level domain name, or one domain name system, one name system for the whole internet, and it flows from a common root. By the way, that's not a political fact, that's a fact of math. Right? When people say, well, you could have alternate roots. Well, you can't have alternate roots in a hierarchical name system. There's one root. That's the nature of hierarchical systems. So this is a fact that is built into the technology because it's convenient. There is some fragility in that, and my company demonstrated this, unfortunately, the other day. So there is some fragility because when you've got one large player, that can become a target. And so you have to build your expectations around that. You have to build a high resiliency. But keep in mind also that the top level domains are cached everywhere, right? Like you don't actually look up .com every time you go and look up a .com name. What happens is that's already cached in your local resolver because everything ends in .com, and so you have these things tend to persist for a long time, and the time to live for the cache is a long time. So there's a technical fact that reduces that vulnerability. The transition itself didn't make a change to any of this. It fundamentally means that you still got this one actor that has this sort of control. The accountability mechanisms arguably made it a little bit less dangerous because you've got this way of holding them to account if they were to do something really bad. And certainly for the RIRs, the accountability got better because if IANA misbehaves now, the RIRs have the ability to fire them. The ITF already did.
So this is Keith. I'll add to that specifically with regard to the naming functions and the root zone file, and changes to the root zone file. And as I said earlier, Verisign, one of our core concerns with this whole process was to ensure that the stability, security, and resiliency of the DNS was protected, maintained, and that there would be no degradation as a result of this process. And we are confident today that it is not at further risk or increased risk. So the changes that took place, though, is basically before the transition, there were 3 parties involved in making the changes to the root zone file, which, as I said, would be the addition, removal, or changes to status of the top-level domains. And that was ICANN performing the IANA functions, certifying that the policies for doing so had been done appropriately, NTIA approving those changes, and then Verisign effecting the change, or making the technical change, operationalizing it. So the only change coming out of the transition is that NTIA is no longer in that authorization function. ICANN, performing the IANA functions, tells Verisign policies have been followed, this is the appropriate thing to do, and Verisign, under an agreement as a vendor to ICANN, performs those functions. During this whole transition process, there was a 90-day testing phase where Verisign and ICANN worked together to certify that we had a system and a process in place that would work reliably without NTIA's involvement. And that was conducted without any glitches, without any problems at all. So I can say that from that technical function and the procedural, the process that's followed, that it's been well tested and that there is no increased risk coming out of this. And as was noted, I think because of the reforms that have been put in place to ensure that ICANN is acting in the interests of the multi-stakeholder community and its own stakeholders, that this is actually a positive development.
Okay. I think our time is up. Ladies and gentlemen, this is what it looks like when I think history is made. This is a remarkable institutional innovation at the global level, affecting the internet, affecting all of us. I want to give a great thanks to everyone on our panel, especially Larry Strickling from the NTIA, Department of Commerce. Thank you so much for coming here today and giving us this presentation. Thanks to all of you for coming.